Coming up. In other words, Coral Springs trained 3 times as often and 8 times as long for each session, meaning that it provided 24 times as much active shooter training as the Broward Sheriff's Office. That is stunning. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk about the Florida Senate and the Florida governor having done something right that should be taken as a positive message nationwide, not just in Florida. Last week, I traveled to Tallahassee with a group of citizens committed to making sure that their state Senate did the right thing. Many of them, perhaps most of them, were like me, parents whose kids were in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School on Valentine's Day, February 14, 2018, when a mass murderer roamed the halls of Building 12, shooting student after student and teachers and staff, killing 17 in a bloody rampage that everyone there that day will never forget. And they, and I as a parent of 2 of the kids present in school that day, will also never forget it. And will never forget the stunning display of incompetence and cowardice by the 8 Broward Sheriff's Office deputies who arrived at the site while gunfire could still be heard from the building, yet they refused to go in. The first one there was the school resource officer from the sheriff's office, Scott Peterson, assigned to protect the school. He was on site when the shooting began, yet he stood outside the building, gun drawn, looking toward Building 12 where the shots were erupting, hiding in an outdoor hallway just a few feet from the room where my kids were hiding. My kids were hiding because they're kids, unarmed kids. Why was an armed sheriff's deputy hiding rather than confronting the shooter? Think about that. His job was to protect the public. His job was to protect the students. His job was to stop crime. He carries a gun not just to display it, but to use it when needed. He was assigned to that campus for years. He had to know dozens, perhaps hundreds of students, certainly including students in Building 12 being gunned down while he was still there, hiding just outside the building. I frankly can't imagine how he lives with himself. He didn't just refuse to engage the shooter, he refused to even enter the building. Incredibly, he wasn't alone in refusing to enter the building. 7 more Broward Sheriff's Office deputies arrived and they stood outside the structure, hiding behind their cars and other objects, or moved to or took up positions well away from the building on the roadway. And this happened before Scott Peterson issued the ridiculous direction on the radio for police to position themselves 500 feet away from the school. This was an institutional failure. We've known, and law enforcement has known since Columbine, that when you have an active shooter, you engage them immediately. You run toward the shooter. The shooter's goal is to kill as many people as possible. The sooner you disarm them, kill them, or at least engage them so that they're in a gunfight with you rather than picking off the intended victims, the lower the body count will be. But that isn't what happened. 8 Broward Sheriff's Office deputies arrived and stayed outside even as the shooting inside continued. And the failure of the deputies to engage the shooter wasn't the only failure. The most senior deputy to arrive at the school didn't take command. Then, when the officer assigned to manage the district arrived, she acted in a way that was described as a dreamlike state. So who finally entered the building to engage the shooter? Officers from nearby Coral Springs arrived and went in almost immediately. In fact, when they realized that Coral Springs was going in, a couple of officers from the Broward Sheriff's Office went with them. Think about that. Officers from the agency with actual responsibility for the school had to go in with officers from a neighboring police department because their fellow Broward Sheriff's officers didn't go in. Unfortunately, by that time the shooter had already left the building, and the police didn't know. How screwed up was the response to the shooting? Emergency medical personnel didn't reach the students on the 3rd floor until nearly 40 minutes after the shooting started. We'll never know how many might have survived if the response had been handled correctly. So how did that happen? Well, we had a school resource officer from the Broward Sheriff's Office that was a flat-out coward, and he was joined by 7 more police from the Broward Sheriff's Office that refused to go in, even as the shots from inside the building could still be heard. As I said, that's an institutional failure, not just a single coward. What else failed institutionally? Well, there were multiple screw-ups by the Broward Sheriff's Office, including Sheriff Scott Israel's pact with the school superintendent Robert Runcie in support of the PROMISE program, which I talked about in episode 16, Broken Promise. That program created a culture in which the expectation was that students would not be arrested and they would have their offenses zeroed out at the end of each year so that a genuine repetitive threat would look on paper like something much less than that. But for this episode, I want to focus on something in some respects even more stunning: the incredible lack of focus on training in the Broward Sheriff's Office. Remember, the Coral Springs police rushed into the building right after they arrived, whereas the 8 Broward deputies that arrived first hid outside or took positions far away on the roadway, even before the school resource officer, Scott Peterson, issued directions on the radio to stay 500 feet away from the school. The Coral Springs Police Department provided active shooter training to its officers every year. The Broward Sheriff's Office did so only every 3 years, and several officers testified they couldn't even remember the last time they received active shooter training. That's bad enough, but it's actually worse than that. Each active shooter training session at the Coral Springs Police Department lasted approximately 8 times as long as an active shooter training session at the Broward Sheriff's Office under Sheriff Scott Israel. In other words, Coral Springs trained 3 times as often and 8 times as long for each session, meaning that it provided 24 times as much active shooter training as the Broward Sheriff's Office. That is stunning. But there's more. The response of the Broward Sheriff's Office to a mass shooting at the Fort Lauderdale International Airport 13 months before the Stoneman Douglas shooting was similarly screwed up. There were tremendous command and control problems, and as many as 2,000 county vehicles ended up blocking off the airport roadways, preventing an evacuation. When Sheriff Scott Israel was questioned about the bungled response, he downplayed claims it was bungled, instead asserting that it was effective and describing it as, quote, controlled chaos, close quote. Moreover, when the Broward Sheriff's Office prepared a report after investigating the response to the airport shooting, the initial recommendations were revised, deleting many of them, including, most importantly, deleting a recommendation that the Broward Sheriff's Office provide more active shooter training. The report was even revised to insert language complimenting Sheriff Scott Israel for his leadership. The message seems clear. Sheriff Scott Israel doesn't want to provide much active shooter training, and he thinks he's doing a great job. Unfortunately, the citizens of Broward County have paid the price for his failures. Does he recognize that he's failed? Apparently not, because shortly after the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting occurred, he praised himself in an interview on CNN, saying that he had provided, quote, amazing leadership, close quote. I would characterize that as an amazing lack of self-awareness. And incidentally, if Scott Israel were in a corporate position of leadership rather than a government employee, When he made it back to the corporate office in the wake of his department's disastrous response, and after saying what he said on CNN, I don't think his key card would have worked at the front door. And that brings me back to where I opened this segment, complimenting the governor and the Florida Senate for doing something right. As you may know, Governor Ron DeSantis suspended Scott Israel as sheriff of Broward County in January 2019, after receiving the report of the Stoneman Douglas Commission, which investigated the events leading up to and in response to the shooting and made recommendations regarding school safety measures. Under the Florida process, the matter then moves to the state Senate for a decision as to whether to remove the sheriff from office or to reinstate him. Under the Senate procedures, the matter goes first to the Senate Rules Committee. As I mentioned, I was one of many, mostly Stoneman Douglas parents, who arrived in Tallahassee to try to make sure that the Senate did the right thing. I was one of the lucky ones. My kids were not injured. But many of the parents of those who died were there, sitting in the front row. We made sure we were there early, well before the doors for the Rules Committee meeting opened, so that we would be in the center of the crowd. Now, I knew that Scott Israel was a powerful Democrat sheriff, and of course I knew the governor is a Republican. But this never should have been a partisan issue. The front row of the audience for that Rules Committee hearing included Fred Gutenberg and Andrew Pollack, two of the most prominent parents of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas students who died in the shooting. Fred is very much a liberal Democrat, and Andrew is very much a conservative Republican. They're on opposite ends of the political spectrum and absolutely aligned in their position, which I share, that Scott Israel had to be removed as Broward County Sheriff. This was not a partisan issue. So as you can imagine, I and many other Stoneman parents were deeply disappointed as we watched the subject being treated by some as a partisan one. We watched as almost exclusively Democratic members of the committee criticized the suspension of Scott Israel. I was even more disappointed when some of the speakers from the public actually contended that this was a racial issue, claiming that African American voices wouldn't have been heard if black school kids had been the victims, that the reason Scott Israel had been suspended was because the residents of Parkland were well off financially. And one speaker even claimed that the majority of Parkland actually supports Scott Israel, a claim I find ridiculous based on my encounters with fellow Parkland residents, and that the parents of the dead kids use their deaths to their advantage and represent a small segment of the views of Parklanders. For that contention, that the grieving parents had used their children's death to their advantage, the chairman of the committee rightfully chastised the person speaking. Incredibly, in advance of the hearing, a special master appointed by the Senate had concluded that Sheriff Israel should be reinstated. He acknowledged that it was a close call, but he recommended reinstatement, taking the position that the sheriff couldn't be responsible for the cowardly actions of deputies. I read the special master's report, and it struck me that he failed to look at the big picture. He looked at the airport shooting and concluded that it wasn't sufficient to justify removal. And then he looked at the Stoneman Douglas shooting response and concluded that it wasn't enough to justify removal, although he acknowledged at the hearing that it was a close call. What he didn't fully evaluate is the connection between the two. The failure of Scott Israel to adjust and learn from the airport shooting. As I noted, the sheriff's lack of focus on training was stunning. Even in the wake of the screw-ups in the airport shooting response, where we know that the result of the internal investigation was to recommend more active shooter training, those recommendations were removed from the final version of the report. For some reason, Scott Israel just doesn't want to provide adequate active shooter training. My personal belief? I don't think Scott Israel saw the Broward Sheriff's Office as a law enforcement agency. I don't think he saw himself as a law enforcement leader. It's little wonder that the office lost its accreditation in the wake of the disastrous response to the shooting. I think Scott Israel saw the Broward Sheriff's Office as a community outreach agency, almost to the exclusion of its law enforcement functions. Listen to Episode 16, Broken Promise, for more of the details of just how far Scott Israel took the Promise program in refusing to arrest teenagers, and then bragging about lowering the teenage crime rate when what was actually happening was that police officers were refusing to arrest teenagers for committing crimes. Combine a refusal to pull teenagers into the criminal justice system and a refusal to conduct adequate active shooter training, and what do you have? You have a recipe for a disturbed youth not being flagged and a woefully disorganized and inadequate police response when an active shooter situation is the result. Scott Israel is the very definition of an incompetent law enforcement purported leader, and I'm proud of the fact that the Florida governor and Senate recognized it. I've been to legislative and regulatory hearings all over the country at the federal, state, and local level, but I've always attended as a company representative, putting forth a position of my employer or client. When I went to Tallahassee, this was something new. I was appearing simply as a citizen, as a parent, and as one of the lucky ones whose kids had not been shot or killed. As I looked at the front row filled with the parents and siblings whose loved ones had died, I was reminded how lucky I had been. Next topic. Who's really in the lead? If you've been following the race for the Democratic nomination for president, you know that over the last 1 to 2 weeks the media has started saying that Joe Biden is no longer the frontrunner. First, they started saying that Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden were co-frontrunners. And then they started saying that Elizabeth Warren was in fact the new frontrunner. I even followed their lead and started referring to them as co-frontrunners. But is it true? Is Joe Biden no longer in the lead? Well, if you look at the Real Clear Politics average of polls, he's still in the lead by 5.4%. And yes, his lead has shrunken dramatically from several months ago, but he's still in the lead. The polls that show him behind Elizabeth Warren are no more recent than those that show him ahead. And there are more that show him ahead than show him behind. And there's no argument that anybody's made that the polls that show him behind are any more reliable than those which show him ahead. Now, polling in Iowa and New Hampshire does show her ahead of Biden, but those are only 2 states, even though they are the states which begin the primary and caucus process. So what is going on? Why is much of the media claiming that Elizabeth Warren is ahead of him when in fact she isn't? Well, it could be that the media, which is so hell-bent on making sure that President Trump is not reelected, has decided that in the wake of the Ukraine corruption allegations involving Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's less than stellar performance on the campaign trail, that he's incapable of beating Donald Trump. I suspect that may be true for some members of the media. But I think the reason for this latest deception by the media is something more fundamental. They need eyes and ears. They need listeners and watchers. You can't maintain 24/7 news without sufficient stories to cover. And if the story is Joe Biden is still in the lead, who's going to listen and who's going to watch? But if the story is, we have a new leader, there's a new sheriff in town, there's a new candidate atop the leaderboard, then people will pay attention. This is but the latest evidence that the news media, which is so critical to the functioning of a democracy or a constitutional republic, is failing in its job. I understand that the news media is a business and it has responsibility to shareholders, but in fulfilling that responsibility, it must not ignore its core function. The core function is to speak truth to power, and thereby to serve the citizens of our republic. It isn't doing that job. Incredibly, after all his gaffes, after repeatedly slurring his words, after uttering phrases on the debate stage which literally make absolutely no sense, after seemingly stating just a couple of days ago that he attended a college which he never attended, and after it was revealed again that he bragged on video about forcing the firing of a Ukrainian prosecutor that was the same prosecutor looking into the company paying his absurdly underqualified son $50,000 to $83,000 a month, Joe Biden is still in the lead for the Democratic nomination. That may not be the story the media wants to cover, but it's the truth, and we as American citizens have a right to expect the truth. And I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits, bringing the truth to you. I hope you'll join me. In the interim, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is called Political Spirits Network. And I'd like to take a moment to shout out to listeners from a couple of new areas. Political Spirits now has listeners in Delaware and New Zealand. That's about as far apart geographically as I can imagine. Thanks to all of you for being a part of Political Spirits. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.